Welcome back to The Spoken Word. My name is Travis, and I'm your host. In our last episode, we made a strong case that the giants of Canaan were probably Nephilim, or perhaps their descendants. The Nephilim seem to have been the spawn of human women and divine beings sometime during the period before the flood, as described in Genesis chapter 6. They were what we might call demigods, part divine and part human. So if the giants of Canaan were bona fide Nephilim demigods, though, a glaring question arises. How did we get more Nephilim after the flood? And if we had Nephilim after the flood, who's to say that they're all gone? In this episode, we're going to try tackling these questions. Here we go. If you turn to the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, you'll see that it enumerates the origins of various nations that will factor into Israel's story. We see names like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Canaan listed among them. All of these nations were said to arise after the flood from Noah's sons. But there are no giant clans listed. We do not see any Anakim or Rephaim mentioned at all in these passages. That's really odd considering how much these clans factor into the story of Israel entering Canaan. But consider this. If we are right, and the Nephilim were in fact demigods, hybrid offspring of human women and divine beings, and the giants of Canaan were Nephilim, then the giants of Canaan came from a paternal lineage separate from that of Noah's descendants. Human patriarchs like Abraham descended from Noah. Nephilim patriarchs like Anak would have been descended from divine rebels. But how do we have Nephilim in Canaan if all of the original Nephilim of Genesis 6 were killed by the flood? There are certainly many theories out there, but there are two main possibilities that I want to bring our attention to. Possibility number one is that there was at least one other incursion between angelic beings and human women that resulted in more Nephilim being made. Or possibility number two, the flood didn't actually kill all of the Nephilim that were born before the flood. The first option, where we have more than one divine human incursion happening, has some attractive features. It lets you have a flood that literally kills every single organism on the planet, and you can also get more giants later on. But there's a problem. A second divine human incursion is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. I would think an event of that magnitude would be somewhere in the text, since Genesis 6 itself made a note of the first incursion, but we don't have any such reference. Granted, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. As we discussed last time, the grammar of Genesis 6 verse 4 could allow the possibility of repeated events, saying that Nephilim appeared whenever, as in each and every time, divine beings mated with women. But no biblical or Second Temple text seems to take this view to my knowledge. A second incursion is a fair deduction. But it's really interesting that if it were that simple, then why is it that nobody in antiquity seemingly took that conclusion? Perhaps they didn't think that it was that straightforward. So in light of that, let's explore the alternative that Nephilim survived the flood, and that they or their descendants were the post-flood giants that we meet in places like Canaan. The first thing that we have to ask is whether or not the flood itself was survivable. Many interpreters would say no. But this may not actually be true. Genesis chapter 7 verse 4 says, 7 days from now I will make it rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing I have made I will wipe off the face of the earth. So, God said that he would destroy everything he had made. As far as we know, he didn't create the Nephilim. They are absent in the created categories of beings in Genesis 1 and 2, even though other chaos creatures like sea monsters and so forth get an honorable mention. These Nephilim existed outside of God's created order. Now, the text goes on in verses 21 and 23 describing what happened during the flood. It says, every creature perished, those that crawl on the earth, birds, livestock, wildlife, and those that swarm on the earth, as well as all mankind. Everything with the breath of the spirit of life in its nostrils. Everything on dry land died. He wiped out every living thing that was on the face of the earth, from mankind to livestock to creatures that crawl to the birds of the sky, and they were wiped off the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. Note the recounting of all the ordained classes of creatures in Genesis 1, apart from fish. Nephilim are not on this list. But there's more to be seen here than just these loopholes. Let's look at how the Great Flood itself is described in Genesis 7:17 through 20 and 24. It says, "The flood continued for 40 days on the earth. The water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. The water surged and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. Then the water surged even higher on the earth, and all the high mountains under the whole sky were covered. The mountains were covered as the water surged above the earth more than 20 feet, and the water surged on earth for 150 days." So whatever this description means, it doesn't mean that you can figure out how deep the flood was by adding 20 feet to the height of Mount Everest. Even proponents of a global flood will concede this fact, not the least of which is because Noah and everyone aboard would have needed supplemental oxygen to survive for 5 months at that kind of altitude. There's a simpler solution to this issue. Let's say that Noah lived somewhere in the ancient Near East, and you flooded the whole horizon as far as he could see. Wouldn't that fit the description that all the mountains under heaven were covered from his vantage point? Nobody in the ancient Near East had the Himalayas, the Alps, or the Rockies in mind when Genesis said mountains. So this text doesn't require extreme elevations like that to be covered. Beyond that, the Hebrew word for mountain here can also simply mean hills. If anything, this text has all the marks of an eyewitness account from Noah's perspective. How did anyone figure out the 20-foot depth part? Did the ark sail over every mountain on the planet so they could take soundings and figure out the depth? Of course not. Did God divinely download this random detail into the Genesis author's brain, only for them to come out of their trance and be baffled at what they had written down? Again, of course not. The Bible is inspired, but it was fully intelligible to its original audience. It didn't fall from the sky. There are much simpler solutions to this. Noah and his family may have taken a local sounding and figured out that the depth was at least 20 feet. If everything was submerged as far as you could see, you could conclude that you were at least 20 feet above local landmarks. Noah could have also looked at the water line on the ark after landing. If the ark's draft was about 20 feet, then he could have deduced that he cleared all the mountains around his region by at least that much. Either way, this doesn't mean literally every mountain in the world had to be covered by 20 feet of water for this story to be true. Now, some will say that continental drift, creation of high mountain ranges, and so forth happened during the flood. So for at least a little bit, the argument goes, every patch of dirt on the earth was flooded. While that's possible, I think it is really unlikely because rearranging the entire globe in a matter of months would have produced enough heat to cook everyone alive on the ark. On top of that, some people propose that God inexplicably also sped up radioactive decay rates for some inscrutable reason during this time. They say this so they can fit all of geological history into a young Earth timeline of around 10,000 years, give or take. If that's true, then you have even more heat and radiation being added to the equation. Enough heat to melt the entire planet's crust and enough radiation to kill all life on the planet, in fact, including everyone in the ark. I don't see anything about heat and radiation shielding in God's building instructions for the ark, so this scenario of accelerated geologic rearrangement and radioactive decay is difficult. It ends with the whole planet getting turned into a molten slag and those on the ark becoming highly radioactive chicken nuggets. The deluge would have been better described as an inferno. If it is possible, then, that some high mountain ranges existed in places that Noah couldn't see directly, that were not flooded, then Nephilim could have survived in one of those places. But that's only one way they could have survived. Could they have heard God's warning and made their own ark? Could they have hidden inside vast underground complexes? Could they have had some kind of help from their divine fathers, the sons of God? Well, none of those ideas are supported by the text. I say that because there are plenty of ways the Nephilim could have conceivably survived the flood with no need for a second angelic incursion. So I think that Nephilim survivorship is a viable alternative. Now, whether by more incursions or by surviving the flood, is it possible that the Nephilim still walk among us today? Before we jump into that, let's take a short break. So perhaps there was a second angelic incursion, or maybe the flood just didn't kill all the Nephilim. Either way, the giants of Canaan seem to have been somehow descended from Nephilim entities. But if we have an unknown number of Nephilim survivors running around the planet, then is it possible that they're not all dead and that Nephilim or their descendants are still alive today? I personally wouldn't rule the possibility out. I do think it is unlikely, though, but I can't reject it with absolute certainty. Most giant myths around the world portray giants as a transient problem and that they eventually went extinct by attrition one way or another. The Bible seems to tell a similar story for the area of Canaan. It is oddly particular about noting that Canaan finally gets cleansed of giants at the hands of King David and his fiercest warriors. On the other hand, we do still have weird stories running around about people encountering unusually large humanoids. In the United States, we have Bigfoot. In the Himalayas, we have the Yeti. Most accounts are almost certainly tall tales, to be sure, but there are so many stories from otherwise psychologically stable people that it's not inconceivable that people could be encountering something. I personally don't think that Goliath was a Sasquatch, to be clear, but I do allow for the world to be weirder than I expect. So without a firm textual statement saying all of the Nephilim everywhere on the entire globe were destroyed, I can't say with finality that there is not one single Nephilim left to this day. But the problem of Nephilim survival raises a bigger problem than Bigfoot. It is likely that the Nephilim of Canaan had children based on passages like Joshua 15:13-14, which names an ancestor and multiple descendants of Anak, the namesake of the Anakim. We also know that Goliath descended, quote, from the giant of Gath, and that he had at least one brother based on passages like 1 Chronicles 20, verses 4-8, and 2 Samuel 21, verses 15-22. In context, it's hard to argue that all of this familial language means something besides genealogic descent, though phrases like son of can be used in other ways besides genealogical descent. Since this is the case, most readers assume that the giants made future generations by interbreeding with humans. If that is true, then one might be concerned that Nephilim blood made it into the human gene pool and persists among us even to this day. Plenty of modern conspiracy theories play off these ideas, but I would contend that we don't have anything to worry about. I'd like to make two observations, one textual and one scientific. First, the textual reasons why the Nephilim probably aren't among us today. First, the Bible never shows us giants with human wives. Despite all of the passages that give some snippets of giant genealogies, we never meet the wife of a giant. We have no textual reason to say that they ever interbred with humans at all. Just because you can mix an angel and a human doesn't mean that you can mix a giant and a human. Second, those who lived among giants were never condemned for the fact of their DNA composition. They were condemned because they worshipped other gods, and for that reason and that one alone, Yahweh brought destruction upon them. Third, giants seem to have had issues mating with humans, if it was possible at all. King Og was the last of his clan, the Rephaim. And that was despite the fact that he was king, and he presumably could have made babies with as many women as he wanted due to his power and status. Because of that, his infertility and lack of an heir is a little bit odd if giants and humans could mix so easily, like some theories claim. This difficulty or impossibility of interbreeding might explain why the Bible names so few Nephilim in Canaan. We have Anak, we have his ancestor, we have the three giants of Hebron, we have King Og of Bashan, we have Goliath, his brother Lami, a giant named Saph, and maybe a couple of other unnamed giants of their generation. And we have Goliath's unnamed ancestor, the giant of Gath. So all told, we have about 10 Nephilim mentioned in the entire Old Testament. If they were important enough to mention in such small numbers, why don't we have mentions like, and Joshua and his men slew 50 giants that day, if there were far more giants around? The fact that we don't have passages that explicitly count large numbers of giants may indicate a relatively small population of Nephilim in the area of Canaan by Israel's day. This would be explainable by a population ground down by attrition and time and unable to breed outside of their own kind, or only able to do so with great difficulty. In other words, Nephilim were going extinct in Canaan by Israel's day. My hypothesis is that while Nephilim may have had a hybrid origin, they represent a distinct kind of organism, to use Genesis 1's terminology. To reproduce, they required female Nephilim. I further propose that female Nephilim were rare by the time of Moses, which would limit their kind's ability to reproduce in large numbers. This would explain the tiny population size. Now, all of that, of course, is speculative. But if it were impossible for Nephilim to interbreed with humans, then that would explain the Bible's complete lack of alarm over them corrupting human bloodlines. People with giants living among them were never called half-breeds or anything of the kind, so the gene pools seem to have never mixed. It's also telling that when God tells the Israelites to destroy a people, it wasn't because they had hybrid DNA, like I mentioned earlier. The rationale is that it's because survivors left alive would woo Israel over to serve other gods. If we take all of that evidence together, I don't think that anyone needs to worry about Nephilim bloodlines continuing to... If we take all of that evidence from the text together, I don't think anyone really needs to worry about Nephilim bloodlines continuing into the present based upon the text alone. They probably couldn't corrupt human bloodlines to begin with, is my position. Now, the alternative explanation of the tiny remnant population and dead-end lineages is that giants could reproduce with humans, but giants were really infertile for one reason or another. This made successful breeding extremely rare. That's fair, but I think the logic of wiping out populations during the conquest would have included some mention of half-breed uncleanliness as part of the reason for wiping out populations. But even if we allow for interbreeding, there's a scientific reason that Nephilim can't be among us today. Put simply, if Nephilim DNA ever entered the human gene pool, any trace of it is almost certainly gone. Put simply, if any Nephilim DNA ever entered the human gene pool, any trace of it is almost certainly long gone by now. Here's why. If you go back far enough in your family tree, your genealogical ancestors stop being your genetic ancestors. In other words, you can be a direct descendant of someone and still carry none of their DNA. That's right, none. The reason is simple mathematics. Each of us inherits half of our genetic material from each of our parents. We get 50% of our DNA from our mothers, 50% of our DNA from our fathers. Since your parents were themselves half of each of their parents, you're half of your grandparents. You have approximately 25% similarity to each of your 4 grandparents. Each generation cuts this number in half once again, 12.5%, 6.25%, and so on and so forth. So if you would like to know what percentage of an ancestor's DNA you carry, the formula is actually rather elegant. Take 1/2, 0.5, and raise it to the power of how many generations back you would like to go, and multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. At just 5 generations, you only carry about 3.125% of an ancestor's genetic material. If you get to around 10 generations in the past, you're no more genetically connected to your direct ancestor than you are to any other random human. The genetic fingerprint of your ancestors simply becomes so small that a relationship between them and you can't be established based upon DNA alone. The genetic trail simply runs cold very quickly. Now, this halving rule might not be followed exactly if Nephilim genes offered certain survival benefits. Genes that make creatures survive better tend to be preserved over time and might not fade away exactly so easily. But from what we know of the human genome, we don't see any traces of genetic material from some kind of a foreign, non-human source in only certain populations. So if Nephilim DNA ever entered the human gene pool, it looks like it wasn't something that would have increased survival and therefore stuck around for very long. So with all that in mind, let's say that you're a direct descendant of one of the last Canaanite giants. Maybe you can trace your lineage right to Goliath himself. Let's run the numbers and see how much of Goliath's DNA you would have left. So first of all, when did Goliath live? Well, it seems that all of the giants in Canaan were gone by the time of David's son, Solomon, and when he took the throne around 970 BC. So from 2025, that's roughly 3,000 years ago. Divide that by a typical 30-year human generation, and you get 100 generations. If you are related to the last Canaanite giant alive 100 generations ago, how much of a giant would you be? A billionth of a billionth of a billionth of 1%. That is how much of a giant you'd be. A billionth of a billionth of a billionth of 1%. That is like a single grain of sand out of every grain of sand on every beach, in every desert, and on every ocean floor, not just on Earth, but on 1 million Earths. Mathematicians have a very clever and succinct way of expressing numbers that small. 0. You would be 0% giant. So even if you could trace your lineage right back to great-grandpa Goliath, you would carry absolutely no trace of any mutant Nephilim genetics. You'd be absolutely 100% human. So without repeated infusions of pure-blood Nephilim DNA, their genetic fingerprint would have been completely stamped out of our gene pool by humans simply obeying the Genesis 1 design to reproduce after our own kind, the very command that was broken to create the Nephilim to begin with. It's rather beautiful. So whether you think that the Nephilim could interbreed with humans or not, I think it is safe to say that either way, the physical Nephilim are gone and they aren't coming back. So that's all for now, folks. There are plenty of ways to explain Nephilim after the flood and even how they might have reproduced afterwards. But I don't think we need to worry about having corrupted human genomes. God's judgment of humans has always been and will always be based upon our allegiance, not our genetics. Who you serve, not who you descended from, is what matters in God's eyes. Next time, we're going to delve into a rarely discussed spiritual aspect of the Nephilim. According to Jewish lore, written before the time of Jesus, dead Nephilim are where demons came from. And if that's true, then the Nephilim may still be with us, but they're not hiding in your genome. But until then, thank you so much for listening. God bless.